Hello, everyone. Thanks for making the time to join us this evening. My name's Michael. I'm the events coordinator and publicist at Annie Bloom's Books. For those of you who aren't familiar with the store, we are located in Southwest Portland, Oregon, in the heart of Multnomah Village, where we've been around for 43 years now, admitting a few more people. We are open on weekdays from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and on weekends from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Our website is always open. You can shop there day and night at annieblooms.com. I am going to put into the chat right now the link for where you can buy tonight's book. We'd really appreciate your support. You can get curbside pickup, in-store pickup, local delivery if you live in the Portland area. We have a couple of different shipping options. I'm pretty sure Randy would be happy to come in and sign books if you have requests. Yes, he's nodding his head. So if you have requests, put those in the comments section of your order. And we would love to fill those orders for you. We have some great events coming up tomorrow night at 5 p.m., a different time. Book is called Love and Genetics. Local author Mark McDonald and his East Coast sister, Rachel Elliott. They are full blood relations, but Mark was given up for adoption when he was really young and they didn't reunite for a decade. So it's the jointly written story of that relationship. Sounds really great. On Tuesday, March 29th at 7 p.m., we have middle grade kids book authors Sonia Thomas, who's local, and Ernesto Cisneros. Sonia's brand new book is Sir Fig Newton and the Science of Persistence. Sorry, I'll keep pausing to let people in here. Getting tons and tons of people in here. This is great. And let's see, we're excited about this one. On Monday, April 4th, local authors PC and Kristen Cast will be presenting their brand new book, Omen's Bite. They're like teen horror authors and super popular. And the night after that, Carolyn Kurtz, who's a local author, her new memoir is Today is Tomorrow, about teaching and doing peace work in South Sudan. So that's on April 5th. Tonight, we have Portland author Randolph Splitter reading from his new novel, The Third Man. He's going to be in conversation with author Stephen Rabe. We'll have a Q&A at the end, so feel free to type questions in the chat and I can read those. Or you can also click on the little blue hand icon that's in the reactions menu that's at the bottom of the screen there if you dare to come on screen live to ask questions in your pajamas. Yeah, so without further ado, I'll let Stephen introduce Randolph.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. It seems almost kind of sadly appropriate that we're discussing Randy's novel, The Third Man. Sadly appropriate, of course, in reference to events in Ukraine. It seems almost things are repeating themselves. In any case, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to first introduce Randy to you, and Randy's going to give you a short synopsis of his book. And then I'm going to ask Randy a few questions, a few probing or leading questions. And then Randy is going to read a little bit from his book. And then hopefully we'll leave at least 20 minutes, if not more so, for questions from the audience. So let me just tell you about Randy. He and I have known each other since Hamilton College in the 1960s. Randy is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Hamilton College, and he subsequently got his PhD at the University of California at Berkeley. And he then taught at universities over the next 30 years. He's the author of 3 books, including a new novel called The Ramadan Dreamer. And he also wrote a scholarly psychoanalysis of Marcel Proust. Now, so we'll turn it over a little bit to Randy, if you could just, in a very short synopsis here, tell us about The Third Man. What's that about?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve. And thank you, Michael, and thank you, Annie Blooms. Before I give the little synopsis, and by the way, thank you all for coming. It's great to see all many friends and family sometimes from a long time ago. I just want to correct a couple of things in Steve's wonderful introduction. Okay, one of the books, by the way, I've written 4 books. This is the 4th, published 4 books. And one of them is called The Ramadan Drummer, not Dreamer, but Drummer.
Drummer, did I say Dreamer?
So
I thought I said Drummer.
Of course yes, of course. But thank you, terrific. Okay, so yes, a brief synopsis of this book so you have a sense of it while I'm doing a little, do a little reading and give you some excerpts from the book. So here it is. From Vienna in the 1930s to England in the 1940s and back, The Third Man is a story of dispossession, refuge, and the search for justice and humanity. Focusing on two Jewish families as the Holocaust approaches, the book zeroes in on two individuals who wind up having to make difficult moral choices. 5-year-old Julie Bernstein, and of course in German she would be known as Julie Bernstein, but for simplicity's sake, we'll call her Julie Bernstein. She, at 5 years old, is sent to safety in England via the Kinder Transport, a program in which Great Britain agreed to take in 10,000 unaccompanied minors, at least temporarily. Growing up in a foster family, troubled by traumatic events, Julie thrives. But the growing violence in British-controlled Palestine, violence that spills over into Britain itself, forces her to reevaluate who she is and what she stands for. Ignaz Nathanson, a butcher's apprentice, escapes to England, is interned as an enemy alien, changes his name, and joins the British Army. He winds up in Vienna and returns post-war to track down the person who, for him, epitomizes the Nazi nightmare. The famous 1949 film, The Third Man, set in post-war Vienna, provides a revealing lens through which to view the events and characters of the novel. With the help of the film, Ignaz comes to a new understanding of himself and of ordinary citizens lured by the false appeal of fascism. Inspired by the experiences of my family, the novel presents a world of dehumanization and danger, but also of courage, love, and shared humanity. I turn it back to you, Steve.
All right. So Randy, this is a novel set in the Holocaust or about the Holocaust. And there's a vast literature on Holocaust studies. There are even at many universities now Holocaust centers that are interdisciplinary, in which they analyze novels, memoirs, various attempts to explain Nazi actions, etc. How would you say that your new novel, The Third Man, is unique and different in terms of Holocaust literature, particularly in terms of novels?
Yeah, as one thing we were talking about before, a lot of the literature, at least a lot of the literature about specific people who went through this period and became refugees or were, fortunately escaped in some way, or some of the victims. A lot of that is about people who were artists or intellectuals, people who are well known, and the literature tends to focus on them. So that's one way in which this is different. It focuses rather on ordinary people. I deliberately wanted to focus on ordinary people, and I wanted to, kind of bring it down to earth. And in terms of novels, I mean, there are many great works of literature about this period, and there are many, good novels about even, refugees from Vienna, very similar to this. But one thing I was trying to do is a little bit different. I think many popular novels tend to be a little bit, tend to romanticize or idealize the events. Even if the events are horrible and tragic, they tend to turn it into, mythicize it in some way, mythologize it in some way, and make it a little less truthful than it really was, a little less horrible, I guess you might say, that it really was. So in some ways I'm changing that. One is that I'm trying to make it very down to earth and, sometimes mundane, something, but very, realistic. Also, I want to focus, as I said, on ordinary people, not necessarily, people who are flawed themselves in many cases. So people who are not necessarily, heroes, but people who are real people who may have undergone these experiences. And also, I want to give those people their own moral choices that they had to face. So it's not simply not just a question of good versus evil, but even good people have moral choices of their own. So all those kinds of things that I was trying to do, I tried to make it more complex than some popular fiction. So those are the kind of ways that my novel, I hope, is different.
This is perhaps much of the audience doesn't know that this is a very personal book for you, in that your parents were refugees from Vienna. Shortly after marrying in 1938, they left Vienna, and you have cousins who were children who were shipped to safety in England. So you could talk a little bit about what the personal experiences, what you learned from your parents, what you learned from your cousins, et cetera, in terms of writing this book.
Yeah, definitely. So both sides, my mother and my father, they both grew up in Vienna. Eventually when they became young adults in the 1930s, and they did get married when they were 23 and 24 in May 1938, which was just a few months after Germany took over Austria. And I will, say Germany took over Austria with the willing participation of many Austrians as well. But there was a Nazi takeover of Austria. So my parents were there at the time as young adults, and they got married in May, and they quickly left very quietly, as my mother told me, without drawing attention to themselves. And that very much inspired this book. And in addition, basically, I had many uncles and aunts and all who also were in the family, and they escaped to many different countries all around the world, which I can enumerate, but I won't. But specifically, yes, my cousins, three sons of my father's oldest sister and her husband, they were sent away by the parents to England on what was called the Kindertransport that I just mentioned, with this program in which Britain did take in some unaccompanied minors. And unfortunately, their parents, my father's sister and her husband, died in the concentration camps. They were in a kind of a complicated political situation. They were forced to go to the Polish-German border. There was a kind of diplomatic tug of war between Germany and Poland. They were essentially deported, forced to go there, and eventually ended up in concentration camps. So all these things, did inspire me to write this book. And of course, I'd grown up all my life listening to stories. I mean, not a lot, but some certainly about growing up in Vienna and all that. But it just so happened some years ago, I read a book called The Hare with Amber Eyes that some of you may have come across, by Edmund de Waal. It's a wonderful book, and he is a potter, a kind of sculptor with pots, an artist of himself, but also a writer. And look him up if you don't know him. And this book, The Hare with Amber Eyes, was a fascinating book about his own family that settled for a time in Vienna. And a very different kind of family from my own. His family was very rich. I never knew that there were rich Jews in Vienna. I never heard of that, because my parents were middle class. But the book does describe, what it was like for when the Nazis came into Vienna. And then I got interested in that. I said, well, what was it really like? What did it feel like for ordinary people? And so I began to read more books about exactly that. And I just read more and more and more and more, and began to think about writing about this as well. And that's kind of how it all started. And I'll answer a question you haven't asked me to continue with that, is that I did a lot of research. I mean, so I had these kind of family stories, but I also did a lot of research, both with autobiographical accounts of many personal accounts, but also broader histories and things on the web, many websites, but also scholarly books as well. So some more popular literary things, some more scholarly things, which all of which informed this book. And I will say also, I went to Vienna and did a little bit of research on the ground and talked to a couple of people there. And I actually also to track some things down that I found it hard to track. I enlisted the help of a PhD student in European history who helped me a lot with some of those things as well. So it's amazing as you get it, as Steve knows, as a very experienced historian. Well, he doesn't know because he knows everything, but I don't as an amateur historian. So from my experience, the more I found out, I realized the less I knew. I mean, there was more and more to know, which I didn't quite know. So I kept on trying to do more research and trying to find it out and try to make the book as authentic and accurate as possible.
Did your when you approached your parents or listened to your parents, and if you asked questions of your parents about their experiences from, say, 1938 to 45,
I
were
did,
they willing to
yeah,
discuss issues openly?
they did not talk about,
Were
the
they,
so
were they, were they reluctant?
they were like,
Wait.
I wouldn't say they were reluctant, but it wasn't a topic that we talked about very much. No, my father was a great storyteller. He told a lot of stories, but that mostly were not about this. He did tell, for one of his stories, he did tell, one of his stories was about how he got to the United States, and my parents were separated. My father was becoming a doctor, and he finished his medical studies in Lausanne, Switzerland, and then my parents were separated and they went to France. My father was an interned in a displaced persons camp, and it was through the intercession of a Portuguese consul named Aristide de Souza Mendes, kind of famous consul who was giving out a lot of visas to refugees, both Jewish and non-Jewish, in Bordeaux in southern France. And that enabled my father to get to Lisbon and take a ship from Lisbon to the United States. So that's one of the stories my father told. In fact, another story, I'll very
Something
briefly.
right out of Casablanca.
Exactly, even more so of Casablanca, I'll tell you. This is one of his favorite stories. Why I don't know, but it epitomizes him, I guess, his personality. He said, well, he was in the displaced persons camp. He was functioning as a doctor. The French let him function as a doctor, sort of attached to the French army in this camp. But he was allowed, he said he wanted to join the French Foreign Legion, which was not true. But this enabled him to get out of the camp and travel down to, I guess it was Marseille. And then and go to this place where they were lining up people to go to the French Foreign Legion, probably in Casablanca or something like that. And then they would say, well, are you married? I mean, are you single, married, whatever? And he said, oh, I'm married. And he said, oh, well, you can't join the Foreign Legion, then you're married. He said, oh, okay, well, we had a good time in Marseille and went back home, went back to the camp. So that was another one of his stories.
So let me ask you just one last question before you do a little bit of your reading. Behind you, everyone can see, is the famous Ferris wheel in Vienna. And of course, you title your novel The Third Man, and you use a variety of scenes from The Third Man to interpret what's happening to your characters. So tell us a little bit why you chose to go down that path.
Yes, the Ferris wheel behind me is the same one as on the cover of the book. It is a Ferris wheel called a Riesenrad in Vienna. And I took that picture myself and doctored it up in various ways, and and became the cover of the book. And it's an iconic symbol of Vienna, which is one of the main reasons I put it on the book. It does show up in the book, but essentially it's there because it's an iconic symbol of Vienna and also of the film, The Third Man. It appears in a key scene with Orson Welles in The Third Man. And I chose that title and all that because, well, because I think it gives added resonance to the book. There are a lot of connections between the film and my book. One of them is that there's a third man in my book as well. I mean, there is a third man in the movie, but there's a different kind of third man in my book who is a very important figure, which you can find out if you read the book. And in addition, the prologue and epilogue of my book, and I'm going to read a little part of that later, show one of my main characters, first of all, becoming a double or a stand-in for Orson Welles in one of the key scene in the movie. I can tell you a little bit more about that later. And then at the end of the book, he and another key character actually see the movie in 1949. And this enables him to develop certain parallels between the book, which he doesn't realize is in a book, between him and between other people that he's encountered and the characters in the movie. So it becomes a way for him, kind of a lens through which he can view his own experiences. And so I think it helps me to do that, I think, in a way that's very resonant, and that's why I chose it.
So would you like to read a little bit from your novel?
Thank you for asking, Steve. I'd love to. Okay, here we go. So the first excerpt that I'm going to read here is about, it focuses on this character whose name is Ignaz, one of my two main characters. He was the guy, if you remember, who is a young butcher's apprentice in Vienna. And this is where he is still in Vienna. This is 1938. And this is right in November 1938 when what happened was called the called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which I will explain a little bit in the text itself. So here it is. Oh, and I should say also that his mother figures later on in this scene. So that's who Clara is. Clara is his mother. Okay. Several customers were examining the meat in the display. Ignaz waited on one while Herr Gittelmann worked at a back counter. Yes, he said, it's fresh, arrived this morning. Perfect for schnitzel. Gut, I'll take 2 cutlets, please. Make sure you pound them flat. Certainly, Frau Oppenheim. He wrapped them up for her and waited on the next customer. Later, during a lull in the shop's activity, Herr Gittelmann struck up a conversation with him. You heard about von Rath, the German diplomat in Paris? It was still early November. The one who was shot? They say he might die. Ignaz, carving a slab of meat, shook his head. Why in God's name did he shoot him? It was a stupid thing to do. His parents were deported, stuck in no man's land on the Polish border. Pouring rain, little food. You can see why he was so upset. What good will it do? Another customer entered the shop. Good, the butcher wondered. Good, I don't know. On Monday, the German diplomat was shot. On Wednesday night, he died. The next day, a rock smashed through the window of Gittelmann's butcher shop. After glancing at his boss, Ignaz wiped his hands on his apron, grabbed a knife, and raced out the door. 3 or 4 youths, armed with makeshift wooden clubs, were standing in front. Filthy Jews, they yelled and ran away. Ignaz ran after them. The news spread quickly through the Jewish community that synagogues and prayer houses were being attacked. Everyone called it a pogrom. For 2 days throughout Germany and Austria, many synagogues were smashed with sledgehammers or set on fire. In Vienna, the Polish shul was badly damaged. The Moorish-style Heitzinger synagogue, the largest in the city, was burned to the ground. The only one to escape major damage was the ornate 19th century Stadttempel in Seitenstättengasse, its facade disguised as an ordinary residence. The apparent reason being that the officials didn't want the nearby church and apartment buildings to catch fire. Clara was lying in bed when she heard a faint knock at the door. She ignored it. The knock came again. Ignaz, she called out feebly, but she realized that he was still at work. At the third knock, she dragged herself out of bed, pulled her nightgown around her, and shuffled to the door. It was Herr Gittelmann, the butcher. Ignaz has been arrested, he said. What? The shop was attacked by youths throwing rocks. Ignaz ran out and started chasing them. How do you know he's been arrested? Maybe he's safe somewhere. He shook his head. I talked to another shopkeeper who told me the SS spotted him and took him away. Mein Gott. Herr Gittelmann stood silently in the doorway. Clara didn't know what to say. After a long pause, she asked, what should we do? I don't know. I thought I should tell you. She nodded. Yes, thank you, Herr Gittelmann. Thank you for telling me. When he left, she sat down at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. After a moment's hesitation, she asked God to keep her son safe, not in any formal Hebrew prayer, not in German, but in Yiddish, the language with which she felt most comfortable. She retreated to the bedroom, threw a shapeless house dress over her nightgown, and slipped on some shoes. Returning to the front room, she wrapped a frayed, well-worn coat over her dress. Then she left the flat, locked the door behind her, and ventured out onto the street. There was a police station a kilometer or 2 away, and she started walking in that direction, passing stores whose large windows had been smashed, the word Juda or Jew painted here and there, broken glass on the sidewalks, all kinds of refuse and discarded goods in the gutters, as if a fierce storm had passed through. Once she lost her way and had to ask directions from an older Jewish woman who looked like a frightened rabbit. Eventually, she reached the station. Yes, the officer on duty asked her. Other policemen and civilian clerks were striding purposely in the background. I'm looking for my son, she said. I believe he was arrested earlier today near. Why was he arrested? Said the officer, a balding middle-aged man with horn-rimmed glasses and a pinched face. That's what I'm trying to find out. Jewish? The officer, who was smoking a cigarette, tapped some ashes into an ashtray. What? Is he Jewish? Yes. Excuse me. They've been taken to an elementary school on Karayangasa. A school? The officer took another puff on his cigarette and coughed. The Gestapo has turned it into a jail. I see. The officer turned back to the papers on his desk. If I go there, will I be able to see him? The man shrugged. I have no idea. She managed to take 2 buses that were traveling in that direction. Finally, she found the school, the makeshift jail. Friends and relatives were gathered outside in the rain, which had now started to fall. They were not being allowed inside. The windows of the school had been covered with thick drapes to prevent the people outside from looking in. Have you found out anything? She asked a woman about her age. Vans leave every hour. They take the prisoners to the train station. The train station? What then? Dachau. Dachau? The woman nodded. It was a prison camp, Clara knew, over the border in Bavaria, one of several where Jews and political prisoners were sent. When did the latest van leave? A few minutes ago. Okay, that's my first reading, and I'll take a glass of water. Just 1 second. Okay, so that gives you a sense of certainly the threat that the folks in Vienna were facing at that time. And my next, I'm going to give you 3 readings. So this is the second one coming up. This one is about my other main character, who was a young girl. She, again, was on kinder transport to going to England. She was just about 5 years old or so at the time. And then she is kind of put in a kind of foster family in England. And she goes to school. And when she's still in elementary school, she kind of makes friends with the other kids there, including a boy named Pip or Philip, who has been evacuated from London because of the Blitz and the bombing, the German bombing of London. So in a way, she and he are alike because they're both refugees to some extent. He has left London to go to this place in Northwest England, and she has left Vienna and arrived there finally. So here are a couple of short scenes describing their relationship. The girls were skipping rope in the playground, the boys kicking around a football in the fine mist. 2 girls held the rope while another one skipped. Julie and a few others stood on the side, clapping their hands and calling out the rhyme. Charlie Chaplin went to France to teach the ladies how to dance. First the heel, then the toe, then the splits, and around you go. Salute to the captain, bow to the queen, and turn your back on the Nazi submarine. Sally, the fresh-faced popular girl who was jumping over the rope, mimed the actions described in the rhyme, twirling around, saluting to one side and bowing to the other before yielding the stage to someone else. 20 or 30 yards away, the boys were racing furiously back and forth over the patchy, stony ground. Panting, trying to catch their breaths, they bumped into each other and called each other names like ferret face, greedy guts, and stupid twit. Meanwhile, the girls called out, Jenny and Johnny sitting in a tree, Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes Jenny with a baby carriage. The football got loose and rolled over to the rope skippers, causing Sally to get tangled up in the rope. "Look what you did," she shrieked. "Stupid boy," said Julie. "What do you know about it?" said Pip, while scooping up the round, thickly padded black and white ball. His hair fell in his eyes like a clump of overgrown grass, and his face was red from the exertion. "What? You're just a bloody German." Suddenly, the rest of the boys and girls started chanting, "Bloody German, bloody German," and pointing their fingers at her. She began to cry, then ran inside the schoolhouse as fast as she could. When school resumed in the fall, Pip seemed to have forgotten about their run-ins of the previous year. He avoided kicking the football into the girls' skip rope circle, peered over Julie's shoulder during math practice, and offered her treats at lunchtime. Their new teacher, Mrs. Yates, said that their thoughts should be with the boys and girls left in London. "Is it dangerous there?" said one of the other boys. "Yes," said the teacher, a small, gray-haired, kindly-looking woman who wore her glasses on the top of her head, but was always pulling them down or pushing them back up. "Bombs are falling. We're happy to have Philip, but some parents just can't bear to be away from their children." Did that mean Pip's mother didn't love him that much? Or that she loved him so much she was willing to be away from him as long as he was safe? Was that why her own mother and father had sent her away? She wondered if the London children would be safe. Did they have shelters in their back gardens where they could hide when the bombs fell? Did they even have a back garden? She and Pip were lucky that they didn't have to worry about bombs. One windy day on the playground, he pulled a long red twist of licorice from his pocket and asked if she would like some. "No, thank you," she said. Pip shrugged, took a bite out of the twisty red snake, and began to chew. As if he had just been getting started, he took out the rest of the contents of his pocket, including a shilling and 2 pence, a black button, a torn shoelace, and a scrap of paper on which somebody had written something incomprehensible. "It's a real treasure trove," said Julie, using some fancy English words she had noticed in one of the books she had been reading. Pip studied the piece of paper and stuffed it in the other pocket. "I'm sorry I called you German," he said, with the licorice in his mouth. "Mr. Brougham says you're Jewish." Julie was so flustered that she started speaking in a mix of German and English. "Ja, ich bin Jüdisch, aber I come from Wien." "What?" said Pip, blinking rapidly. "Oh, sorry, I mean, what you said is right." "He says you killed Jesus, but that's okay because it wasn't your fault." "Jesus? Fault?" Barbara, a long-limbed girl who excelled at sports, ran by with her braids flapping wildly in the wind and tapped her on the shoulder. "Come on, Julie, we're skipping rope. You can talk to your boyfriend later." "What? No." But she had already flown past. Okay, that was the second reading. And now I'm going to give you one last reading. And this one actually is basically a condensed version of the prologue, the very beginning of the book, but it actually takes place chronologically much later in 1949. So you'll see this is all about this man who does change his name, as I already explained. So he's now called Nigel. Now you can read the book to find out why he changes his name and what was the cause of that. But this is when he becomes a stand-in for Orson Welles in the movie The Third Man. And a little personal note here is that my uncle used to tell the story that he did exactly that. Whether it's true or not, I've found it hard to pin down. But my uncle, who was in Britain at the time and did come from Vienna, of course, and but he was in London, and he did list his profession in his becoming a citizen. He listed his profession as a movie stand-in and double, actually, and he did join the British Army, like my character, but that's kind of where the resemblance ends. But this is where I got the idea of part of where I got the idea of The Third Man, and certainly the idea of him being a stand-in for Orson Welles. So So here goes. Early 1949, the ad had appeared in the classified section of the Daily Mail. Wanted body doubles and extras for film production at Shepperton Studios. No experience necessary. Something about the notice struck a chord, and even now he continued to think about it. He had never acted, had no aspirations of becoming an actor, so it wasn't that. He knew nothing about the movie. It could be a fast-paced adventure story or a slapstick comedy for all he knew. But maybe the gray pallor of post-war Britain, the continuing rations, and his own occasional nightmares had him seeking the bright lights of Hollywood, or at least Shepperton. Or maybe he was just a little bit tired of the burden of being himself and thought it might be interesting to try out another part. So that was how he found himself a few weeks later, taking the underground as far as it would go and then boarding a bus to ferry him the rest of the way. It was bitter cold outside, but sunny, and the sun felt good as it streamed through the steamed up windows and warmed his face. He was surprised by the size of the studio site. Acres of woodland surrounded an old manor house. A receptionist directed him to a bare, windowless room with scattered chairs, couches, and tables, where men and women were standing around talking. Nigel punched a cigarette out of the pack that he had buried in his front pocket. He stood by himself and blew smoke toward the high ceiling. Tentative conversations were springing up around him, and most of them centered on the movie they were all hoping to be a part of. Someone said it was a post-war thriller about a criminal on the run. Someone else said that it was set in Europe, Rome maybe, or the ruins of Berlin. In fact, people said most of the scenes had already been shot on location. After a few minutes, a woman in her mid-40s, maybe older, sat down next to him. "Could I borrow one of your cigarettes?" she asked affably. Nigel poked out another one and lit it for her with a cheap lighter he had purchased recently at Woolworth's. She blew out the smoke and thanked him. "Done any acting?" Nigel shook his head. "Me neither." The two of them smoked for a while in silence. "You're not from around here, are you, love?" she inquired. "Pardon?" "Your accent. It's not native now, is it?" No, it wasn't, but he felt flustered. A young woman in a wool skirt pushed open the door and called his name. "Mr. Nicholson? Mr. Nigel Nicholson?" He stood up and crushed the cigarette under the sole of his shoe. Of course, that wasn't the name he was born with. "Nice talking to you, Nigel," said the woman with the umbrella. "Good luck." "Same to you," he said, trying to sound like a BBC newsreader. As he followed the aide out of the room, she sized him up. "Yes, you are rather a large man." "Is that what they're looking for?" he asked. Yes, as a matter of fact, especially the feet." The hallway was low and narrow, and after a long walk, they took a sharp right turn. "Feet?" She glanced down. "What size are they? 11, 12? Her questions made him feel huge and ugly, like a monster in a children's book. She herself was a small slip of a thing, barely 35 or 34. Sorry, barely 5'3" or 5'4" in height, with a small button nose and a tiny waist. 12, he said, size 12. Brilliant. The young woman deposited him like a giant flounder she had managed to reel in at the feet of a man who sported a thin black mustache on his upper lip. The man also looked down at Nigel's feet. "Yes, they are large," he said, rubbing his mustache. One of the director's assistants, a young man in a hurry, corralled Nigel and asked him to take his socks and shoes off. Nigel took them off and rubbed his feet, which were a bit sore from the long trip to the studio. The young man soon returned with dark socks and a pair of shiny black wingtips. "Here," he said, "try these." Nigel put them on. "How do they feel?" "Good." Nigel stood up and took a few tentative steps. The shoes were hard and stiff, but he traipsed back out to the set. "Brilliant," said the director. He led him onto the set and positioned him in the shadowy recesses of a dark doorway. The young assistant appeared and christened his shoes with a few fishy-smelling sardines. "What's this all about?" said Nigel. "The cat," shouted the director from his perch. "Where's the cat?" The young production aide emerged from the sidelines and said, "Right here." A small cat or kitten with gray markings and a white chest leaped from her arms, ran toward him, and devoured the sardines in 3 seconds. Then it started licking his shoes. "Quiet on the set," said someone. The director issued a command and the cameraman started filming. The cat continued to run its tongue over his shoes. After 30 seconds or so, the director called, "Cut." They did 5 or 6 more takes, often pausing to add more sardines to his wingtips. After it was all over, the young woman escorted him back to the front of the studio. She confirmed his address and told him they would send him a check. "So it's a thriller?" Nigel asked her. "A mystery?" Something like that. Food shortages, black market, shady characters. The actor whose place you're taking is Orson Welles. He's a big man like you, about the same height, though you're not as stout as he is. Welles? Yes, he had vaguely heard of him. Is he the hero of the story? Hero? Hard to say. He's quite mysterious, actually. And it takes place in Berlin? She shook her head. No, Vienna. Vienna. Nigel scratched his chin. Funny, he came from Vienna. What's it called? The Third Man. Okay, and I think thank you all for listening. And I think Michael is going to field some questions.
Be happy to. If folks want to put those in the chat, I'm happy to read them to Randy, or you're welcome to come on screen if you want to ask them in person, as it were.
As it were, yeah, virtually and in person.
Yeah.
Let me break the ice, make it easier for other people. Let
Thanks,
me ask
Steve.
this question, Randy. The main character, your main character is Ignace/Nigel, who is totally against stereotypes, or at least as people who are presented in the Holocaust. He's a huge man. He's powerful. He's athletic. He's working class. He's a con man. He does all kinds of things you didn't mention. We hadn't had time to mention that he cuts off a man's finger to help him with gain
Oh, you're giving away all the story there, Steve. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
He trades food for sex. He's very decisive. He's not against brawling. He's a kind of a con man, although many of his actions are easily rationalized given the situation he finds in. So did you choose to take somebody that's just seems so different from what's often portrayed in Holocaust literature?
Yes, absolutely. And it's not just Holocaust literature, but I didn't want to make him some kind of larger than life hero. I wanted to make him a life-sized human being. I wanted to make him, a real human being. And I wanted to make him someone who, again, was not all good. And I wanted to give complexity, including moral complexity, to the novel, so that he, as a hero, is also, he's not really a hero, but he's more of an anti-hero than a hero, but he's still a very sympathetic character, because we get inside his head, we know his motivations, his feelings, his love for his mother, for example, and later on his, love and attachment to other people as well. So he has a lot of good qualities, but he also has bad qualities, which he begins to recognize about himself. And this is kind of a gradual moral awakening, you might say. And even larger is his view of other people. Again, I won't spoil it, but other people that he encounters and how he begins to see them in kind of a new light as well. So yes, I did want to make him again, a real person, an ordinary person, a working class person, rather poor for sure. That he and his mother live in a very, very small, older tenement apartment. Again, just as, I will say, just as, for example, the book, The Hare with Amber Eyes, deals with a very, very wealthy family. I wanted to deal with middle class and working class people, they're all real, but I wanted to show that side of things as well.
I think it's very effective.
We have a question from Wendy Bush. Asks, does one need to watch The Third Man before reading the book?
No, absolutely not. You'll find out something about the movie The Third Man in the book itself, and you certainly don't have to watch the movie. But a friend of mine told me that he was moved to watch the movie after reading the book, so you can always do that.
One ought to watch the movie anyway, right?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great movie. I mean, it's a very engaging movie for sure, and does give you a very good sense of post-war Vienna, which my book also, part of it takes place right then and right there. So it gives you a sense of what that was like, a bombed out ruin, black market, shady dealings, all that kind of stuff. So sure, if you can watch it, watch it.
We have a question from Neil.
Hello, Randy. It's a
Hi,
pleasure
Neil.
hearing you talk. Couple of questions. One, the description you had of the little girl was really real. It dealt with the nuts and bolts of everything from running from her personal devils to a desire to have acceptance to the 1,001 things. Generally, when somebody has that much of a pulse on a child, they are keen observer of children, that maybe it gives them some insight or gives them the ability to create a composite character. Is anything like that resonate for you?
Of course, I have two daughters who are no longer 5 years old, no longer, quite that young, but watching them grow up was part of it, I guess. And, and there are lots of other children, I guess, that I've encountered along the way. And of course, we were all children once too. That's part of it. And I'll mention that again, my particularly one of my cousins, Eric Reich, was on the kinder transport. I don't know what his experiences. I actually do know something about his experiences. And he was a boy and then later a young man, not a girl. So it's all a little bit different. But some of the experiences in the kinder transport, I read a lot about the kinder transport. There are many memoirs and many accounts of the kinder transport, and I read scholarly books about that as well. And I read Eric's autobiography as well. So all those things, and more specifically, as you were saying about a young child, probably viewing my daughters growing up, I guess was the most important thing, I suppose. I'm not sure. And thanks for the question, Neil.
Who is next?
Maybe as a former teacher, I should call on people.
Absolutely.
Students always love that, of course. I could also ask myself questions.
Wait, we have someone. We have Sharon. Go ahead, Sharon.
Hi there. I know you've written novels before, and I'm wondering how this novel fits into your evolution as a writer.
Yeah, thank you. Now it's a great question. Yes, I have written. I've written several novels, and one of those novels, The Ramadan Drummer, was published. I've written other works of fiction, nonfiction, all that. As I told you how I became interested in this subject and writing about these events which relate to my family, and so that's how I got into writing historical fiction. And I feel I liked that. I find it very interesting in a lot of ways. One is that there's a lot of real concrete things in terms of people, events, places that you can draw on. And I find that very interesting. Another aspect of it is that the research becomes very fascinating. You can learn a lot. And finally, I guess I would say, history is can be a mirror to our own times. And it's often easier to see things in a somewhat constrained historical context. It's constrained because it's in the past and we sort of have a better handle on it than we do about what's going on in our own time right now. So kind of for all those reasons, and probably some more, I find it's really valuable to write historical fiction, and I also really like it for that reason. So evolution. So my next book, or the one I'm beginning to work on now, is also a historical novel. And it takes place also in Vienna, but earlier, the end of the 19th century, early the 20th century. So I'm investigating, more about, my parents' homeland, and studying a little German, learning more about Vienna and the German language and on and on and on. So I guess I enjoy learning things. And so it's very fascinating for me to both learn and to create and do something imaginative at the same time. And people like Steve, who is an historian, and my other historian friends, I mean, I can understand why they enjoy being historians too, because it's obviously inherently fascinating. You could learn not only about the past, but also about the present in a way. And by the way, Steve, I will ask Steve a question, which I'm sorry I forgot to ask you, because you two have as you said, a book coming out, as you told us before we came on the air. Steve is a very experienced historian. He's written many academic books on American foreign policy, and particularly about U.S. relations with Latin America. But his most recent book is a more personal book called The Lost Paratroopers of Normandy. And it too it's around the same period, World War II period, and it is inspired by his own father's experience. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, Steve.
Thank you.
And thank you, Sharon, also for your question.
Thank you for the opportunity. The Lost Paratroopers has a lot of parallels with Randy's The Third Man. My father, but it really isn't much about my father, but my father was part of the 82nd Airborne that jumped into Normandy on, actually just before D-Day. They took off on June 5th and landed about 2:38 in the morning in Normandy on June 6th. His group, the group of 9 planes, were the farthest off target. They were totally off target because it's still not understood why, but they were totally off target. And they landed near an unoccupied French village that was surrounded by Germans. And my story is about what happened and how the relationship developed between the villagers who decided that they wanted these paratroopers to stay, not to leave them, to defend them, and promised to feed them, to scout for them. And ultimately, the decision was made by the paratroopers to stay where they were, so far off target, because they could never get back to their original mission, and simply wait for the boys on the beach who were hitting the beach to gradually make it to them, which was about 40 miles away. But as it turned out, they were right in the path of an SS division that was heading towards Omaha and Utah beaches, and they would ultimately be overrun. But the story is more about the French people, and particularly young French girls, who did everything to save the paratroopers when they were overrun and hid them. And in the case of my father, he was one of 21 people who's hid in a barn for 3 days by 2 young girls, 12 and 19, who, after they gathered all of the paratroopers who were after they'd been overrun by the SS, they decided to tell their parents they'd hid 21 paratroopers in the family barn. And then, but the parents came to their rescue also. And it's also a story about intense evil, in that the SS men who captured wounded Americans, as well as the medics who stayed to take care of the wounded Americans, they executed everyone. And if they had caught any of the other paratroopers, and ultimately about 100 made it back to safety, they would have executed all of them. The paratroopers couldn't defend themselves anymore because they had simply run out of the ammunition. So it's a kind of story. The subtitle is a story of resistance, courage, and solidarity in a French village. And it's a kind of, in a way, Randy's book is kind of morally ambiguous. And this is kind of a good feeling book about how people who believed the Americans came basically saying, we are here to liberate you. And the French villagers believed in liberty, fraternity, and equality. And the two came together. And so I did a lot of interviewing of the children of paratroopers. I had known about these stories when I was young, but my academic life got in the way. So we did a lot of interviewing of the children of paratroopers. And then we went to Normandy And we interviewed one of the girls who was 12 at the time and is now close to 90. And it's kind of an overwhelming experience to meet someone who made your grandchildren possible. Because without these ladies, that my father and all others would have perished. On this lady's mantle, which is right between in the town of Carrata, which is right between Utah and Omaha beaches, she has a Legion of Merit medal, which is the highest award you can give to a citizen who helped U.S. troops. And she has letters of commendation from General Eisenhower, President Reagan, President Obama. It's really quite amazing that you, the little old lady who's got all these letters about how she helped save 100 paratroopers. So it's particularly a story about them. And she's a 90-year-old person now who likes being famous. And so today, reporters from the AP, from Reuters, from the BBC are outside her home, and she just waves them in and come on, I'll tell you my story, etc. So that's what the book is about. It's being published by Cambridge University Press, and they intend to release it just before Veterans Day. Thanks for the opportunity, Randy. Thanks for the opportunity.
We have a couple more questions here. Thank you, Stephen. That sounds really cool. Elizabeth McKenzie asked a great question. How did you land upon the narrative voice in this novel?
That's a good question. I would have to go back and scratch my head. I've actually worked on this novel for about 5.5 years. Partly because of doing research, so as well as writing and rewriting. So I think I had various characters in mind, and then I began to focus on these two main characters. I guess because they represented kind of different sensibilities, one being male, one being female, one being somewhat older, one being, just a child, one being a young adult, one being a child, one being a kind of a tough guy, one being a kind of a sensitive, young girl. So I guess I felt that those were two very distinct perspectives that provided, kind of, double point of view on most of the major things in the book. And so I hit on them. So it's third person, but most of the sections are from their points of view. A few small sections from other related characters' points of view. That's kind of how it developed. And those two people, by the way, I should say, they do intersect. I mean, for the most of the book, they don't, but they start off in Vienna. There is a connection between them, and they do cross paths at the very end of the book as well. So there's a kind of a sense of a focus, I guess, that helped me to focus too, that they are kind of connected as well. Cool. And thank you, Lisa, for the question.
George. Oh, sorry, you're muted, George.
There I go.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you think that it took you to reach a certain age to delve in or discuss this topic? I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor, and I feel as I'm growing older, it's something that I'm more inclined to write about or to explore, because you had to obviously do a lot of research on this. Do you think you could have written the same book in the same way maybe 20 years ago?
Probably not. It's a good question. Thank you, George. I mean, yeah, I mean, I only became interested in it, I guess, sadly, after my parents had died, which always is the case, I guess, or frequently is the case. And that's a reminder to my daughters to ask me questions while I'm still here. And you can learn things about your own, ancestry. So after they passed away, then I began to think more about it, I guess. And maybe, the older you get, then the more you think about your roots and your origins. So I thought more about it, and perhaps I was a little bit more sophisticated as a writer as well at that point, having once retired from teaching and working. I had a little more time to write, and therefore I had a chance to sort of just practice that craft. And so was able to perhaps then develop this kind of story a little bit better as well. So yes, it kind of needed time to be able to do all that. So you're right. And so thanks for that question. And I've been helped by George too, because you've done a lot of research on your own, and you've helped me with, very interesting things about my own family, as well as parallel things about your family, other families like that, but even about my own father. So thank you for that as well.
And I just wanted to add, my mother was on a kinder transport, and her boyfriend of 10 years, he was a Holocaust survivor from Vienna, who was there during the time you spoke about. And so he was a Ritchie boy. And so
Oh yeah, okay. Right.
Yeah, so anyway, so there's a lot of things in my own family history that makes me interested in your subject. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you.
All right, we're just after 8 o'clock, so I don't see any other questions. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you again, Michael, and thank you to Annie Blooms. Thank you, Steve, and thank you for all my friends. Thank you so much for, I don't want to say that there aren't millions of fans who have never heard of me who are coming here as well, but many of you are my friends, and I really appreciate your being my friends. I hope I can be a good friend to you as well. And it's just terrific to see you all, and thank you for coming. I'm great to share this all with you.
And anyone you know who wasn't able to attend tonight, this is being recorded and it'll be up on our YouTube channel in about another hour or so. The link is going to be at the event page on our website where you probably registered from. So you can go there, watch this again, share it with friends and family. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.